Here's just 6 words. Go see, ask why, show respect. So get out of your office, whether that means going out into the hospital, going down to the factory floor. Eric Ries and others in the lean startup movement talk about get out of the office and go see your customers and understand the problems they're trying to solve firsthand. Asking why, beyond curiosity, like trying to dig to root causes of problems is a really important habit. And then at the risk of it sounding like a slogan, showing respect or having respect for people. I mean, we could talk a whole while about what that means in particular. And I'll say it doesn't mean being soft on people. Like respect for people also means challenging people to do their best and to reach their peak potential. So we use those practices even in KaiNexus, of a software company of about 50 people, compared to like big global mega manufacturers.
This is the Entrepreneurs United podcast with your hosts, John St. Pierre and Rich Hoffman.
Hey, entrepreneurs. Today we're having a conversation with someone who's also a podcast host who has 2 podcasts, and he has episode 500 and episode 250 that are dropping right in the relative same period of time. Mark, talk to us just to start things off about your experience with podcasts, and in particular, the one regarding mistakes. I think that would be interesting to get into.
Well, sure. Thank you for having me here, and thanks for asking about the podcast. I started a little brief history. I started blogging in 2005 at a site called leanblog.org that was focused on what we might call lean manufacturing or lean management. One of my mentors, really a luminary in that field, we had done a text-based email back and forth interview, and Norman Bodek was his name. He was in his late 70s, and he said, you should do a radio interview with me. I don't have a radio show, but in 2006, podcasting was starting to become a thing. With Norman, I started a podcast, and like you so kindly mentioned, 500 episodes later, I'm still interviewing people and enjoying that. And then in September 2020, I launched another podcast called My Favorite Mistake, which was an opportunity to interview a wider range of people focused on this theme of learning from mistakes, a favorite mistake story that each guest shares. It's not necessarily their biggest mistake. It might be, but like more importantly, we celebrate when people are willing to admit and share a mistake, and more importantly, how they've learned from it or how it helped them grow. And that's really what My Favorite Mistake is focused on.
Mark, we have to ask, just leading off of that, what has been your favorite mistake?
Yeah. It's fair enough to turn that question around. And John, I'm going to get to ask you that question as a guest at some point. There's a couple mistakes, nothing life-changing or life-shattering. I think early in my career, I made the mistake of being too much of a solo change agent. As an industrial engineer, I think part of the engineer training is trying to come up with the answer, the correct answer. And in a workplace, I was still working in manufacturing then. It's not a simple calculation to figure out how to improve, let's say, the inventory management system for a part of a factory, which was something I was tasked to help improve. And some of it was on me. I was focused on getting the certification and completing the project. Some of it was a function of culture, where it wasn't really a culture that valued the engagement of frontline employees and production team members. I wouldn't be allowed to really shut down production to have them really deeply involved in the project. So part of my mistake was not pushing back harder against that cultural tendency to say, hey, if this is really going to work, I need to get deeper involvement of the people who need to use this inventory planning system in their production area. So I put together a system that was technically correct, that frankly just never got used. But I got my certification, I got my diploma from the training, but the organization didn't get the benefit. Part of my lesson learned is to not allow myself as a consultant to be put in that situation of someone saying, hey, Mark, we want you to come in and fix it. That's probably not what leads to the best solution, and it's certainly not going to lead to something sustainable. So I've tried to learn from it and not beat myself up. It was more than 20 years ago. I've learned from it.
Mark, why'd you choose to focus on mistakes and the learning lessons there? You could have had a podcast that said, my favorite success, my best relationship, my biggest mentor. You could have had a podcast that was named anything. You picked one that focused on mistakes. What's the value of that was so important? You titled it that and themed it that.
I mean, that's a great question. There's a deeper discussion to be had. The one way of answering it is I have been a big fan of Sheryl Crow, the musician and songwriter. And one of her hits in the 90s was a song called My Favorite Mistake, which I think was about an ex-boyfriend or something. So that phrase just stuck with me, my favorite mistake. And I think it's strangely positive in a way. And I think there's been a trend in entrepreneurship to share more about failures in Silicon Valley and other settings, that this recognition that, yeah, we want to try to prevent failures, but it's more important to learn from them or fail small in a way that allows us to adjust and improve and not fail big. So there's those factors. And then going back to my roots as an industrial engineer and in lean manufacturing, there's sort of two sides to a coin around mistakes. Like one is this practice of preventing mistakes, or what we might call mistake proofing. But then at the same time, having a culture that recognizes we're all human, we're still going to make mistakes. So let's react to the mistakes that do happen constructively so we can go back and further improve our attempts to prevent. And those are a couple of things from my professional background that just overlapped and came together. It's easier for people to talk about successes, but I thought maybe I could differentiate. I'm not the only one doing a mistake-based or failure-focused podcast, but that's a little bit of the story there.
Okay. And what's the constructive use of mistakes as it relates to lean?
I think having this, a lot of this comes back to culture and leadership behaviors. And two of my guests in the My Favorite Mistake podcast series were Toyota people. And so when we talk about their culture or how do we cultivate a similar environment in our workplace where the focus is on learning from mistakes. And when I think a lot of organizations have this habit of being punitive, and mistakes are by default unintentional. Sometimes in the literature, and especially around healthcare, they'll use this phrase, unintended mistakes. And they're all unintended, right? Otherwise, we would call that sabotage or assault with intent. But when organizations are punitive, that just drives people to get better at hiding and covering up the mistakes. We can't learn from them. And the two Toyota stories were very similar. One, Asao Yoshino started at Toyota in Japan in the 1960s. The other one, David Meyer, started at Toyota's plant in Georgetown, Kentucky in the late 80s. And they had stories that were so similar in terms of they were involved in loading the wrong chemical into a machine. And that led to all sorts of production problems and basically and they were afraid they might get fired. And basically management said, in a nutshell, we're sorry we didn't set you up for success. We're sorry that we put you in that position. We need to learn from this and make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think those stories are so consistent, like to me, that it's not a coincidence. It must be a pretty intentional culture. And I think it would be good to see more of that in other types of businesses.
If we were in an elevator and we had 15, 30 seconds on a ride together, and I found out that you were skilled in lean, and I said, what does that even mean?
So lean management, lean manufacturing is in a way is a generalized way. There's going to be a short elevator. We try again. I'm starting to think of a high rise. So lean manufacturing is basically a set of technical methods and management methods focused on engaging people in designing work, better managing work, better improving work, with the real focus on the customer and business priorities of safety, quality, delivery, and cost in that order. So it's very different than a cost-focused or cost-cutting methodology. Okay, bing, I think we've reached our floor.
Got it. Good. Follow-up question. When I asked you a couple of questions ago, tell me about the place where learning from mistakes meets lean. And the first thing you said was something in the regard of culture and leadership behavior. Can you dive into that a touch more when we're talking about technical management methods to improve work safety, quality, delivery, cost? What are the very often that you see as a consultant, as a coach, as a speaker? What are the opportunities to use lean when we're talking about culture? And then when we're talking about leadership behavior, what are the opportunities entrepreneurs should be aware of there?
Yeah, I think a lot of these management behaviors and practices have proven to be really transferable, thankfully, from different types of manufacturing into healthcare, where I've done a lot of consulting work. It's been a big focus of my professional life since 2005, or into software companies. I'm wearing their shirt today for those who are watching, a software company called KaiNexus that's been growing for about 12 years now. So these are companies of different scales, physical products versus web based technologies. But I think there's a couple of key principles. One is shifting away from the old style of what people might call command and control leadership. The leader knows all. The leader is always right. The leader can't be questioned. I'm gonna tell everyone what to do, and you need to just follow my orders. That doesn't work well. It doesn't scale well. And so trying to shift away from that involves trying to engage everybody in improvement, in continuous improvement practices. One more specific tip might be getting rid of the traditional suggestion box, whether that's a box on the wall, or sometimes people create a digital suggestion box where ideas sit and rot for weeks or months before some committee reviews them and maybe says yes, but usually says no. We can engage people in continuous improvement, or what the Japanese call Kaizen, of really trying to engage everybody every day in small incremental improvements. And then one other thing I would add, I think pithy advice from Toyota people, I've heard it in 6 words. I tend to be wordier than that, but here's just 6 words. Go see, ask why, show respect, right? So get out of your office, whether that means going out into the hospital, going down to the factory floor. Eric Ries and others in the lean startup movement talk about get out of the office and go see your customers and understand the problems they're trying to solve firsthand. Asking why, I think beyond curiosity, like trying to dig to root causes of problems, is a really important habit. And then at the risk of it sounding like a slogan, showing respect, or having respect for people. We could talk a whole while about what that means in particular. And I'll say it doesn't mean being soft on people. Like respect for people also means challenging people to do their best and to reach their peak potential. So we use those practices even in KaiNexus, of a software company of about 50 people, compared to like big global mega manufacturers.
When you mentioned shift away from command and control leadership, the first person I thought of was General Stanley McChrystal. Are you familiar with some of his work?
Yeah, his book Team of Teams.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with Stanley McChrystal. Are there other people who you look at for inspiration or source with your methodology and thinking around command and control, or do you ascribe to Stanley McChrystal, or where do you get your philosophical ideas around that?
Yeah, I loved the book Team of Teams. It was fascinating. I've never served in the military, and I did work with an amazing hospital lab director going back about 15 years ago. He had retired from military medicine and now was working in civilian sector in a children's hospital. And he taught me a lot about military culture. There's a stereotype of the drill sergeant in boot camp, and a lot of yelling and a lot of command. And Jim really helped me understand that, yeah, there might be times on the battlefield where, sure, command and control is important because do as I say or people are going to die. But day to day, he said that culture was a lot more engaging of people and inclusive and listening, not just barking orders. But McChrystal was fascinating of how They talked about how even in combat, they would have to shift from strict command and control to more of, I'm going to share, I think the phrase was commander's intent. Like, here's what we're trying to accomplish and why. If you may need to deviate from plan a little bit and use some judgment. And that idea of explaining why is something I learned from Toyota people very early in my career. If you have to tell people, look, here's our job procedure, and here are the 14 things we need to do, and in what sequence, explaining why, that's treating people with respect. That's treating them like adults. Here's why it has to be done this way. I can internalize that because I care about safety and quality. I'm more likely to follow that SOP. So that's some thoughts on my crystal, but other influences, and if you want to dig into this deeper, we can. In no particular order, the famed American quality guru, W. Edwards Deming. He passed away 30 years ago, but I think his influence is still lasting around the world when it comes to quality and improvement. I think one other more current author, Dan Pink, who I had as a guest on both of my podcasts. One of his books that I think was amazing was called Drive, which really emphasizes the power of intrinsic motivation, which is something Dr. Deming wrote about and taught about. And when we think about the traps and the problems that organizations get into when they're so focused on extrinsic motivation, I would say Dan Pink is also a big influence around how I think about things. And then two other people I'll mention real quickly, like when it comes to this topic of psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, a professor from Harvard Business School, who's written books including The Fearless Organization, and her most recent is called Right Kind of Wrong, which is about learning from failure, right in the ballpark of my work on learning from mistakes. And then also Timothy R. Clark, who's written another excellent book called The Four Stages of Psychological Safety. So I think I'm good at synthesizing from different influences and thought leaders and combining that in different ways that have been helpful to me.
There's a lot there, Mark. First of all, Rich, the first thing that connected me in the first part of the conversation was Aaron Deal, fail, yeah.
Yeah.
And how companies need to celebrate failure, not punish mistakes. And what Erin talked about a lot, Mark, was she would have the companies get together and build poster boards of their failures, and they would celebrate them. They'd be like, yes, we now know that didn't work, as opposed to being ashamed of them and hiding them and putting a brief that maybe explains something a little bit differently to hide what actually didn't work over here, and those kinds of things. And when companies can celebrate mistakes, they can then open their eyes to, okay, we celebrated it. Now, what do we need to do to make sure that we move forward? But by celebrating them, it highlights them. It brings them more to the forefront of the discussion. And that's something I'm sure you would subscribe to. And then the second part of this conversation, this whole commander's intent and command and control, is another conversation, Rich, we've had on another podcast as well and went pretty deep into. So both conversations.
That was Brandon Williams, who was in the Air Force, that talked
Mhm.
about commander's intent with us.
Yeah, exactly. And so all these premises really come to fruition here in this conversation. And here's my question, Mark. Entrepreneurs listening to this podcast, you have been working with entrepreneurs and going into their companies and really helping them seek out continuous improvement, seek out lean methodologies in terms of how to improve what they're doing. What would you say to entrepreneurs who have never had maybe an expert come in and show them some of these methodologies? What would you say would be the one thing they should do today, tomorrow, to start thinking through how they can improve their business, how they can, you mentioned this, go see, ask why, and show respect. So I got that. We've captured that piece. But what else should they be doing or thinking in order to improve their business?
I think there's a couple of things leaders really can do and must do. So I think first off, if we want high performance, I think that requires a culture of improvement and innovation. Part of how we get a culture of improvement and innovation is by having high levels of psychological safety. Part of how we build psychological safety is through what leaders are doing related to learning from mistakes. And so I think there's really three pieces. For one, leaders, it helps when leaders lead the way. Greg Jacobson, who's one of the co-founders at KaiNexus, is one of the best about humbly and candidly admitting things like, I made a mistake, I was wrong, I could be wrong, so let's go test this idea. He's got a confident humility, if that sounds oxymoronic, but like he practices that behavior that he hopes to see in others, right? So I think leaders need to lead the way. When they do lead the way, I think they've earned the right to effectively encourage other people to follow their lead. We want you to speak up. And I think if leaders just start with the encouragement, I want you to speak up, I want you to feel safe, like people might not believe it the same as if the leader has led by example. And then once you've led by example and encouraged people, when people follow your lead and start to speak up and admit mistakes, you've got to react constructively and think more about rewarding the person for speaking up, which doesn't mean like literally, hey, here's a Starbucks gift card, perhaps. Certainly not punishing and not just tolerating the speaking up. You've got to reward it. And again, the alternative is people not speaking up, people hiding things, people deflecting blame and doing things that don't help us improve as an organization. So maybe sometimes the very, very first step, though, is for leaders, and I try to do this myself, is to reflect on my own mistakes. Like if I can't admit a mistake to myself, how am I going to admit mistakes to people I'm working with? Like some people might need to go through that sort of that inner journey of trying to be kind to yourself, trying not to get too upset with yourself to be able to maybe apply some of those same mindsets and practices to others when they speak up about a mistake.
Yeah, I love that. And so to recap, it's like this trickle down effect, right? Okay, so in order to have a culture of continuous improvement, you need to have a proper culture that can accept it. And the way to get the proper culture to accept that is it needs to be a lot of safety in the workplace, right? Psychological safety. And the way to get that is to demonstrate yourself with confident humility and vulnerability, intentionally doing it, intentionally saying, I'm not sure if I'm right on this one. What do you guys think? And, or, you know what, that was a bad decision. We shouldn't have done that. Whatever, demonstrate the behavior. And then when you see the behavior, reward it and acknowledge that someone else had humility, somebody else was vulnerable. And you basically create this culture, going back to what I said with Aaron Deal as well. I love what you said. Like, hey, we're going to celebrate the fact that we're not perfect. No one in here is perfect. And we're completely okay with that. So let's be okay talking about it. So I love that. Take me a step further. So that culture is created. How would, if I wanted to get together with my team, let's just say I wanted to have a continuous improvement session. There's no specific agenda. I want to get the team together and I want to talk about all the areas of our business we think that we can improve. There's a lot of methodologies I've seen over the years of doing that myself, which is just a brainstorm. We just put ideas on the board. There's the sticky note version where you put all your ideas on the sticky notes, you put them all over the place. How would, if you were to come to our company today, or if I as a leader was going to go run, or you and your company was going to run a continuous improvement session, how would you suggest a leader run that session?
I think you can come at improvement in ways that are both top down and bottom up. I think depending on the circumstances, if the business is running pretty well in steady state, and it's a good to great opportunity, you might start with a bottom up approach of asking employees, like maybe quite literally 2 questions. What bugs you and what can we fix? And trying to shift. In some organizations, people get labeled, unfortunately, as complainers. And they may be good at pointing out problems. Like then the easy follow-up question is, what do you think we can do about that? Right? And probably 80% of problems, it seems, can be addressed by a team that's like close to the frontline work. That other 20% might have to be escalated to leadership. It's a more systemic problem or a policy issue or something involving a vendor or a supplier decision that someone else has made. But trying to keep a lot of the focus on what can we fix so that you avoid, I think, the dysfunction of trying to escalate everything to leadership. Like, I'm going to point out the problems and, okay, boss, you solve it all. Like, that's not scalable. So I think the bottom-up improvement, especially if you're trying to spark improvement, you want to let people work on things that matter to them without worrying too much about ROI or strategic alignment. But now on the top down direction, if we're struggling as a business, we might really start and say, hey, we have some high level business challenges that we really do need to focus on. And from leadership team down, we try to apply some of the same problem solving methods that we would learn through the lean management disciplines of root cause analysis and experimental style improvement. We could apply that to high level business problems related to profitability, revenue, cost, growth, quality, customer satisfaction. We could try to understand as an executive team, what are the biggest gaps that we need to close to drive better performance for the business? And then from some of that top down direction, we could ask everybody else in the organization then to try to choose small improvements or projects that are prioritized in a way that does align to some of that top down strategic intent. I think a lot of times people talk about Kaizen style continuous improvement and they think it's only about the employees improving things like that. Again, like that's a huge piece of the equation, but we can't delegate everything to the frontline employees any more than the frontline employees can shoot everything up the chain to leadership.
So when you had talked, I want to just take a step back. When you had talked about psychological safety and how we treat mistakes and the leader leading the way, and John, you had validated around vulnerability and confident humility. I feel like over the course of doing the podcast and how you and I have evolved anyway, John, I feel like we have some common language around what does that mean to be vulnerable? Mm-hmm. I want to ask you a question on that, but the context to it is really interesting. I had an email yesterday where someone in our organization said, hey, I'm about to do a weekend with my wife that I want to treat like an offsite, but I haven't been as vulnerable with her as I'd like to. And I wanted to get some ideas from you on how do we talk about our 3, 5, 10-year goals for our life together, and how do I introduce vulnerability into our relationship? Mm-hmm. I was talking to my 10-year-old yesterday about what was good and what was bad about our days. And I told her, I said, I was really honored that somebody would ask that of me.
Yeah.
And her question was, what does it mean to be vulnerable? And I didn't have an answer at the ready.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious from you, Mark, first of all, how would you answer that, particularly with a 10-year-old? Like in simple language, what does it mean to be vulnerable? Mm-hmm. And then my follow-up question is going to be, a leader who's never been that, what are your recommendations to break through some of that ice around the best foot forward and needing to look perfect? And you are in charge, so you've got to set the standard and everything because everybody else is behind you. So I can't look like I'm not perfect. But like, how do you break through that? So again, first question, what's vulnerability? How would you describe that to a 10-year-old? Follow up, how does somebody get started in it who's never done it?
Yeah, I mean, vulnerability is a word I've thought about a lot. And again, I'll credit Timothy R. Clark. One of his definitions of psychological safety is a culture of rewarded vulnerability. Now, I think sometimes people struggle with that definition because we know the word, but I think there's connotations. If someone says, they might think vulnerable means being weak, which is not what the word means at all. That someone says, let me be vulnerable for a minute. You might think, oh God, they're going to tell me some embarrassing thing that I don't really care to know about them. Vulnerability isn't necessarily oversharing. I think the 5-year-old explanation, or even the explanation to an adult, is that vulnerability, doing something that's vulnerable, is an action that's scary because there's some sort of risk involved, like risk of personal or professional harm. Going on, it's just about anything we do. Coming onto a podcast is a vulnerable act. Like maybe I ramble on too long or I don't articulate things clearly. And then people think, oh, this guy, Mark Graban, he's a dud. And like maybe it hurts my reputation. Like there's risk, right? If I was so afraid of that risk, I wouldn't come on and do the podcast. Or a live stream might be more vulnerable because that's scarier than a setting where there might be a polite edit to something. So The thing I try to remind people about being vulnerable is that if you're doing something that's vulnerable, like speaking up and disagreeing with your boss, that's not a reflection on you. That's a reflection on your boss or the workplace environment that you're a part of. So, like, we can encourage, when it comes to employees, before we come back to executives, I think instead of encouraging employees to be vulnerable, which means to put themselves at risk, we need to reduce some of the risk. We need to reduce the fear factor so that we don't have to be as vulnerable, or we could think about fearful. And that's not being cowardly. It's just, I think it's realistic. Now, for leaders, you're right. I say half jokingly to a leader, I would say this to a leader I already had a good relationship with. Like, if you think your employees think you're perfect, like we should probably go check that assumption. Because they probably know that you're not, and that's okay. And like, I think some people feel like admitting they were wrong will make people think less of them, when I think it's actually quite the opposite. That's true. I think it's when people know the boss has made a mistake and the boss won't admit it, then people start thinking like, oh, they're delusional, or there's something wrong with them, and I worry about the future of the company. So I think executives have that fear, though. Again, it's natural, it's human. They feel vulnerable. They're afraid it's going to hurt their professional reputation to admit a mistake. Maybe an executive coach could help them work through some of that.
I think of Brene Brown when you were talking about vulnerability, including risk, that one of the things she had talked about was she went to a group of a military gathering and asked them, can anybody give me an example of a time where you had to display courage in which you did not feel vulnerable at all?
Mm-hmm.
And nobody could come up with anything in the military, where it's like the most, I mean, you're getting bullets zinging by your head, right? So in a much lower risk environment than your life is on the line, in a professional setting, there is risk. There is perceived risk in being vulnerable and saying I'm not perfect and saying I made a mistake and putting that out there to be judged. So I really like where you went in terms of psychological safety is about reducing that risk. So people are willing to put that out there.
Right.
Rich, as you're saying that, I'm sitting here thinking to myself, Mark's podcast is not the biggest mistake.
Right.
Your worst mistake.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a very positive connotation of your favorite mistake.
Yeah.
It strikes me as I was listening to you guys talk about the word vulnerability, that I don't know if I want to be vulnerable anymore. I don't want to be at risk.
Yeah.
It sounds scary.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's part of the issue, right? Is the whole definition of vulnerability is to put yourself at risk. And I don't want to be at risk. Why would you want to be at risk? No one wants to be at risk. And so for that reason, I think my perception is that if the reason why people aren't as vulnerable is because they don't view it as to be vulnerable is to be rewarded for something. It's actually to prevent risk. Right. And so there's this thing that goes through your mind of like, why put myself at risk if I don't have to? Whereas in reality, in a business as an entrepreneur, if you are vulnerable and you have confident humility, you actually can be rewarded, because go back to that whole commander's intent conversation, or command and control, and Stanley McChrystal, the reason why in the moment where he could say, we are going, let's go, and everybody would start running through the brick walls, is because in the moments that he needed to, he got rewarded for his vulnerability and humility. And so I guess I just say all that to say maybe part of the issue we have with the world of vulnerability is the negativity associated with it. I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts on that.
I want to weigh in real quick, and then I'll yield to you, Mark, is that I think this is deeply rooted in children, and I think it's reinforced by the school system and reinforced by parents. Think about the school system. You take a test, you are going to be judged. You're going to get a grade, and you want to be right, not wrong. You don't get rewarded for being wrong. As a parent, there's a time that is, by the right time, a kid needs to take a shower. And if they don't take a shower by that time, they're wrong. And it's not okay to be wrong. You need to do it by a certain time. You need to clean up your room. And cleaning up your room means a certain thing. It means this, not that. And if you don't do it right, you've done it wrong. So that's what we're asking for from leaders is actually incredibly counterculture
Yeah.
to psychologically what we're developing as a society at a very young age. I think we're up against something
Yeah.
big here.
Yeah. And I think by the time people get into the workplace, that can be a real challenge. But I think there are mistakes, execution mistakes. We meant to say one thing, we said another thing by mistake. And then there are decisions. Some of those decisions might be a mistake, like not taking a shower for a week, probably a mistake, right? But that's more of an active, conscious choice. And I would say a culture of psychological safety, or even one that emphasizes learning from mistakes, doesn't mean zero accountability. It doesn't become a free for all where I think one misunderstanding of psychological safety is I get to do whatever the hell I want because psychological safety. Like, well, that's not exactly it, right? Psychological safety means you can be candid, that you can speak up and admit things and challenge things without being punished. I also wanted to build on real quick what John was saying that, yeah, the word vulnerability has a certain negativity to it where I don't like, I don't think it's helpful to say you should be more vulnerable. I think when we flip it and talk about the action, which is being candid, I think that's a positive. We want to be candid. We often hold that back because we're thinking through what's the benefit of speaking up versus what's the risk of speaking up. We can, I think, framing it that way. You want to be more candid, right? Yes. Because if I can't be candid in the meeting, I'm going to be candid in the hallway. I'm going to be candid in the Slack message channel. You want the candor to come out in that more natural, authentic way. And when that's not punished, that candor, being candid, isn't as vulnerable.
Yep.
Right. So I think vulnerability is a potential outcome of the candor. And I think it helps. I'm curious your reactions if I were to say, hey, please be more candid. We're going to
Yeah.
reward that.
You know what? I haven't connected those two, but I love the combination of radical candor. I think there's a book called Radical Candor, I
There
believe.
is.
I love the connection of because just by hearing it, yeah, of course I want to be of course
Yeah.
I'm going to be rewarded by being. People are going to think I'm honest. Yes, I want to be. I want to display that. But then when you think about vulnerability, you're thinking, oh no, I don't want to put myself at risk. It's
Yeah.
kind of, so I
Yeah.
love the twist.
And John, the idea that Mark has brought up around being candid in the meeting versus outside of the meeting,
Yeah.
my connection point to that is Pat Lencioni's work, where they would say that a political environment is one in which what you say changes depending on who's in the room.
Mm.
Yeah.
So the whole object of organizational health is to get being candid to happen in the room.
Mhm.
So there's not a meeting before the meeting and there's not a meeting after the meeting. There's one meeting that all of the best ideas are put on the table that are challenged in respectful ways, but they are challenged. And all of the candor happens in the meeting. So there's nothing to talk about after the meeting. It all
Right.
happened in the meeting.
And then ideally the best decision wins as opposed to the political environment where it's based on whose idea was it because of hierarchy or other factors. And I think if we want a meritocracy of ideas, that means we want and need everyone, diverse set of voices to be candid.
Yep.
And to speak up. And again, like psychological safety means you feel safe to disagree or to challenge something. It doesn't mean you're always going to get your way. It doesn't mean you have safety from being disagreed with in response, but it's, do I feel safe being candid or not? And hopefully everybody's candor kind of contributes to framing better experiments to run as a startup or any business, to be able to more candidly evaluate those experiments. And back to Dr. Deming, he's famed, among other things, for talking about this cycle, like the plan, do, study, adjust cycle, which I think is very helpful. And a lot of that's similar language in Eric Ries's lean startup framework of build, measure, learn. And it's drawn as a cycle. So we build something, we measure the impact, we learn from it, we go back and change what we've built. Like it's an iterative process of working our way to a great solution instead of knowing we have the great solution and just moving forward with it.
This is awesome. Mark, there's been a lot of great messages here for entrepreneurs. Also, you have a book out, The Mistakes That Make Us, as well. Where can people get more of your book or podcasts and learn more about you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for having me. They can go to mistakesbook.com. They can learn more about the book. If they're worried that it might be a mistake to take the dive into buying the book, they can download a free chapter at mistakesbook.com/chapter. They can go to mistakespodcast.com if they want to learn about the podcast. And mistakespodcast.com actually goes to a page on my overall website, markgraban.com. But the book is available, print editions, ebooks, audiobooks, pretty much anywhere you might be interested in buying that.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us here today.
Yeah, thank you both.
Thanks, Mark.
Stay tuned as John and Rich unpack today's conversation.
John, many of the concepts today were not new to us, but they were stitched together in a way that really hung together. When he went through high performance connects with improvement and innovation, connects with psychological safety, connects with how we treat mistakes, connects with the leader leading the way with vulnerability and confident humility. Again, each of these individual concepts we've talked about, and we even referenced in the episode with Mark, Aaron Deal and Brandon Williams, but the way that Mark described them and the way he stitched these to hang together really connected for me.
Yeah. What I love is entrepreneurs always think the way I did in this conversation. Okay, so what should we do? Should we get the sticky notes? Should we do the dry erase board? What's the best way to have continuous improvement in my organization? And Mark took us a whole different way, right? Forget about the sticky notes for a second. Get out of your office, go talk to people, show them respect, and show that you can display humility, that you can show that you have some vulnerability, that you're not perfect, because guess what? They all know you're not. They talk about your mistakes anyway, whether you talk about them or not. So if you can display that and create that culture and that psychological safety, all of a sudden, if you start rewarding people for coming forward with ideas of mistakes that have happened and ideas from things that can get better in the organization, and you reward them for those thoughts, guess what? They keep coming. They keep coming with new ideas to help your organization move forward, and people feel like they're a part of what is being built versus just a cog in the wheel.
That I love thinking in bullet points. I love taking complex things and making them simple. And I'll remind you of a couple of them that I got, and then I'll tell you the one I got from Mark. That John Dame, a former podcast guest of ours, when he was asked about strategy, it was very simple. It was the allocation of scarce resources. And then Merritt Khan, who is a podcast guest of ours, when she was asked about emotional intelligence, she had said, how well do you understand your own emotion and how it impacts others? I think I've got a bullet point from Mark that I'm going to be able to reiterate a couple years down the road. Psychological safety, culture of rewarded vulnerability. And then vulnerability includes risk. So I think that is so tight. And I know he referenced somebody else. He didn't take credit for it. And I forget who he referenced, but he referenced somebody else as psychological safety is a culture of rewarded vulnerability.
Yep.
I'd never had that as a bullet point. If somebody were to say to me, hey, what's the importance of psychological safety? And by the way, what is it? I would have had word vomit for a couple of paragraphs probably. Now I don't. It's a culture of rewarded vulnerability.
Yeah. So you just also mentioned what your bullet point would be for vulnerability, but let me just challenge that for a second. Go back to the conversation you had yesterday with your 10-year-old daughter.
Yeah.
How would you now answer that with some thought, right? You had now had 24 hours to think about it. You've had this conversation with Mark. Dad, what is vulnerability?
Yeah. And she was asking the context of in a marriage, because that was the example I gave her that I was asked about. And I would say it includes some element of risk where you may feel judged or you may feel like you are less than, even by somebody who's your spouse. That would be how I would describe it to her. And as a matter of fact, I'll take the challenge you haven't issued yet. When she gets home from school today, I'm going to say that to her and see if that connects. I imagine it will.
But in the context of saying that, it brings me back to the conversation we just had. If your 10-year-old daughter feels like vulnerability is the act of taking a risk, even with those that you love, is that something she's going to want to do next week?
I will
If that's
tell
the message.
you, Shelby and I have done our best to create a culture with our kids in our home of you need to tell on yourself when you've done something wrong. Don't make us catch it. I will tell you over the course of the last probably 2 or 3 weeks, there were 3 times where Paige, our 10-year-old, told on herself. And when she's done that, there have been no consequences. So we have reduced the risk and we have rewarded her by saying, hey, thank you so much for letting us know. We'll fix that or we'll clean that up. We had an example with our 16-year-old around New Year's Eve where she had some questions for us around going to a party. And we did the same thing. We didn't forbid her from going to the party. We had a conversation with her about how to attend, what could go wrong. And we appreciated and thanked her for bringing that forward. So we are in our household, and I'll translate this to in our business, actively trying to reduce the risk so people do want to come forward and volunteer mistakes and tell on themselves so we can have a conversation about it and find the learning lessons and have these things not be hidden away.
Yeah. So if I think about that, and this is, we're going way off. This is not a parenting podcast. This is for entrepreneurs.
However, the parallel between great leadership and great parenting,
Yeah.
we probably should do a podcast on this between the two of us to be able to go back and forth on those parallels. So I'm with you. This isn't a podcast on that, but it is incredible the parallels between the two.
Yeah, but think about the definition, right? Like, not to call out what you said because I put you on the spot,
Yeah,
but I
sure.
said, what would you tell your 10-year-old daughter? You'd say the element of risk.
Yep.
But then what you've demonstrated with Paige is that by her being vulnerable, she's actually felt free. She's felt
Yeah.
rewarded. She's felt a whole bunch of other things from an emotional perspective. And I would actually say, if I'm an entrepreneur and I'm trying to teach my team or wanting my team to be vulnerable, I got to display it. But if somebody on my team would say, what is vulnerability? I'd say maybe I'd change the definition, maybe in a more positive light, which it's the act of being honest and being candid and being rewarded by building relationships through that candor or something like that. It's a whole
Yeah.
different definition than it's putting yourself at risk, even with those you love. Like it almost has this like negative definition.
Yeah,
And
you're right.
to me, every time I hear this world of vulnerability, we're like, hey, leaders, be more vulnerable. Kids, be more vulnerable. And they're like, if the definition is put myself more at risk, I don't like that. But if I know there's a reward mechanism to it, that's maybe more encouraging. So the definition is problematic for me still.
Yeah.
And I'd be very curious if you twisted that definition to Paige, how she'd receive it differently.
Yeah, if I were to twist it based on what you just shared, that I got to say I agree with, I might say something along the lines of vulnerability is sharing something which initially you believe does not serve you in an environment that you feel safe. Although you can be vulnerable in a not safe environment and get punished for it, but that might be the positive framework that I would put forward. So literally the example, silly example with Paige, but she's 10 years old. We have our 2 vehicles parked in the garage, and just the way the garage is designed, one of the doors, if we don't park way on the left side, one of the doors is going to hit the other car. That's happened a few times, and there are a couple of little dings on the wheel well of the car on the right-hand side. And it was within the last 3 weeks that Paige said to me, hey, Dad, can I tell you something? I know I'm going to get something that she's volunteering at that point. I said, yeah, sure, you can tell me anything. I opened the door and I accidentally had it go out too far and it did hit the other car. And I said, hey, thank you so much for letting me know that. No problem, to be careful, and it sounds like you know what to do next time. Yep. Something along those lines. She was sharing something that initially she probably believed did not serve her. Doesn't serve her to say I hit the car. She knows that's not a good thing, but she did it in an environment where she was safe. There wasn't risk, or she wouldn't have put that forward.
Yeah, and she built trust as well in the process, which I love. And I think that to sum up this whole conversation, right, is how do you create a culture of continuous improvement in your organization?